My name is Madison Clark. I'm 28 years old, and I live in Plano, Texas. What I'm about to share with you isn't just a story. It's a memory burned into my skin, stitched into every thread I've ever sewn, and echoed in every laugh I've ever forced myself to swallow. It starts with a dinner, a dress, and a brother's mockery. But trust me, it ends somewhere you won't expect. You see, people often think revenge has to be loud, explosive, or cruel. But sometimes, the sweetest revenge comes quietly, wrapped in silk, embroidered with dignity, and served at the same table where they once laughed at your pain. Growing up in Plano, I was always the quiet one, the one who played with fabric scraps while other girls played dress-up. I didn't want to wear the princess dress. I wanted to know how it was made. My world was made of thread, patterns, and pages torn from fashion magazines I couldn't afford. But in my family, creativity was considered a hobby at best, a waste of time at worst, especially by my brother Nathan. Nathan was the golden boy, quarterback in high school, top of his business class at UT Austin, and now a rising star in corporate real estate. Everything he touched turned to gold, or so my parents liked to believe. At family gatherings, conversations orbited around him, his success, his clients, his future wife, and when the topic drifted to me, it always stopped short, like someone had accidentally mentioned a dead pet. Before I go any further, pause for a second and tell me in the comments. What's your name and where are you watching from? I want to know who's on the other side of this story, because the truth I'm about to share isn't easy. It's the kind of truth that many people choose to bury. But not me. I'm sharing it now because I know there's someone out there, maybe you, who's been made to feel invisible, who's been silenced, and maybe, just maybe, my story will give you the courage to speak yours. So don't go anywhere, and don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss how this all unfolds. I didn't mind, or at least I told myself I didn't. I had my sewing machine, my sketchbooks, and the quiet comfort of knowing who I was, even if no one else seemed to care. But that doesn't mean it didn't hurt, especially when Nathan made it his mission to remind me that I wasn't living up to the Clark name. "You still stitching in your little room, Maddie?" he'd say during Thanksgiving dinners, his voice sweetened with sarcasm. "Let me know when you've made something worth wearing in public." And everyone laughed. That laughter, that sting of collective dismissal, was what fueled me every single day. I had been working silently for years on my own designs, creating a small online following through Etsy and Instagram under a pseudonym, Clara Maid. I never told anyone in my family. It was my secret sanctuary, where I could create without judgment, where people actually appreciated what I did, where orders came from strangers across the country who didn't know my last name and didn't care that I hadn't gone to Fit or Parsons. They just wanted beauty. Last spring, after months of saving and sleepless nights juggling part-time jobs, I received an email that changed everything. One of my designs had been selected to walk in a small but respected fashion showcase in Dallas, the Atelier Collective. It wasn't New York Fashion Week, but for me it was validation. My work was good. Good enough to stand beside others. Good enough to be seen. I didn't tell anyone, not at first. I spent the next few months in obsessive preparation. I poured everything into a single piece. A dress that wasn't just fabric and stitching. It was a story. A culmination of pain, pride, and perseverance. The outer layer was a deep wine-red satin with sharp seams that curved like a question mark, symbolizing the doubt that had followed me my entire life. But the inner lining was soft gold, embroidered with tiny words stitched in the same handwriting I used in my childhood journal. "You are not invisible." I didn't want to just make something beautiful. I wanted it to speak. The night before the showcase, my mother called. There was a family dinner planned the next evening, celebrating Nathan's new promotion. She expected me there. "It's been a while, Madison. Nathan asked about you," she said, as if that were reason enough to rearrange my life. Normally, I would have said no, but something told me, maybe for the first time, I shouldn't hide. So, I did something bold. I finished the dress early, slipped it on, and went to the dinner straight from the venue. I didn't stop at home. I didn't change into something appropriate. I walked into that restaurant, La Cima Club in Las Colinas, wearing the very piece I had just unveiled to a crowd of critics and designers. The moment I stepped inside, conversation stopped. My mother's eyes widened, her fork frozen midair. My father blinked twice before clearing his throat. And then Nathan, my brother, my critic, my shadow, looked me up and down and let out a sharp, incredulous laugh. "What the hell are you wearing?" he blurted, half standing from his chair. "Did you get that off a Halloween clearance rack?" The table erupted in forced laughter. Even my aunt covered her mouth to hide a smirk. My face flushed, but I didn't flinch. I stood taller. "Actually," I said, my voice calm but steady, "I designed it." Nathan's expression faltered for a second, just long enough for me to see the gears turning in his head. Then he scoffed. "Oh, of course, that explains it." But what he didn't know, what none of them knew, was that less than an hour earlier, that same dress had been praised by a regional buyer from a boutique in Austin who wanted to feature me in their fall collection. That same dress had received an offer from a local photographer for a collaboration. That same dress had just gotten a standing ovation from a woman whose designs had graced runways in Paris. But none of that mattered to them, because they still saw the girl who played with fabric scraps, not the woman who built something real out of silence. I sat down, smiled politely, and said nothing more. But inside me, a seed had been planted, not of bitterness, but of power. You see, revenge doesn't have to be cruel. It can be as simple as showing up in your truth, fully dressed, unapologetic, letting them see, without saying a word, how wrong they were to doubt you. That night didn't end with a shouting match or a dramatic exit. It ended quietly. I ate my salad, toasted to Nathan's success, and walked out with my head held high. But that wasn't the end of the story, not even close, because what happened next was something no one saw coming, and that's where it gets interesting. The week after that dinner was a whirlwind I hadn't prepared for. The boutique in Austin sent over a preliminary contract. They wanted exclusivity on my next 3 pieces, plus a feature in their upcoming catalog. I read the email 4 times before I let it sink in. My heart was pounding, not out of fear, but disbelief. Someone wanted my work. My real work, not my last name, not my brother's reputation, just me. I didn't tell anyone in my family. I spent the following nights in my tiny apartment, surrounded by fabric, sketches, and the kind of exhaustion that comes from finally being seen. The apartment was small, a 1-bedroom above a noisy taqueria on 15th Street, but it was mine. My landlord, Mrs. Gutierrez, always brought me leftover tamales when she knew I was pulling all-nighters. She had no idea how important those small kindnesses were in a world that often felt like it was built for someone else. Nathan, of course, didn't mention the dinner. Not a call, not a message. He went right back to posting pictures of boardroom victories and gym selfies, as if I hadn't turned every eye in that restaurant. My mother sent a passive-aggressive text a few days later. "You looked dramatic at dinner. Your brother was just joking. You know that, right?" I didn't answer. What was the point? For them, my entire life was a phase I hadn't grown out of yet, but then something happened I didn't expect. 2 weeks later, I got an invitation to Nathan's engagement party, held at a private hall just outside Plano, the kind with valet parking, crystal chandeliers, and a strict dress code, formal attire only, the kind of place that made people like me feel like intruders. The invite came with a handwritten note from his fiancée, Juliana. "Would love to see you there, Madison." It would mean a lot to Nathan. I almost tore it in half, but something about the way it was phrased, "it would mean a lot to Nathan," got under my skin. Not because I believed it, but because I knew he didn't expect me to come. I could feel his smirk through the paper, already laughing at my absence before I'd even decided. That's when I realized I had a choice. I could do what I always did, stay quiet, stay small, or I could show up, not as the overlooked sister, but as the designer. So I got to work. I pulled out a bolt of ivory organza I'd been saving for something special. I sketched, sewed, ripped seams, and started over again. The design was sleek, simple at first glance, but filled with hidden details. The neckline folded delicately like origami. The back dipped just enough to draw eyes but not cheapen the silhouette. On the inside hem, I embroidered a quote in gold thread. She remembered who she was, and the game changed. The night of the party arrived like a slow drumbeat. I parked a block away and walked the rest of the way in stilettos that pinched slightly, but gave me an extra 3 inches of height and confidence. I had my hair swept up, minimalist makeup, and no jewelry but a pair of pearl studs my grandmother once gave me. They were the only thing my family ever passed down that actually made me feel proud to wear. As I approached the hall, the valet glanced at me and blinked. "Name, miss?" "Madison Clark," I said, watching his eyes flicker with some recognition, probably from the guest list, not from me. The doors opened into a room that gleamed gold. Juliana had spared no expense. Every table was dressed in satin, candles flickered in tall vases, and champagne flowed from a glass fountain in the center. Guests milled around in gowns and tuxedos, the air heavy with perfume, laughter, and polished arrogance. I spotted Nathan near the front. He was talking to a group of men in matching navy suits, laughing at something one of them said, holding a glass of whiskey like a prop. When he turned and saw me, I watched his smile freeze, just for a moment. Then, like a mask snapping back into place, he raised an eyebrow. "Madison?" he said, loud enough for heads to turn. "Didn't expect to see you here." I smiled. I figured it was time I made an appearance. Juliana approached with an air of genuine warmth, her eyes sparkling. "Oh my God, Madison, you look stunning. Who designed your dress?" I tilted my head. I did. A small silence passed between us. Juliana's face lit up. "Seriously? That's incredible." She turned to one of her friends nearby. "You have to see this dress. Look at this neckline, it's like sculpture." Nathan stayed quiet. He looked at me the way someone studies a painting they've seen 100 times, but suddenly realizes they never understood. Then came the question I'd been waiting for. "Still doing that fashion thing?" he asked, the corner of his mouth twitching. I took a sip of champagne. "Actually, yes. One of my pieces was just picked up by a boutique in Austin, and a photographer wants to feature my line next month." He opened his mouth to respond, but Juliana jumped in. "You're launching a line? That's amazing. Nathan never told me that." "Probably because he didn't know," I said smoothly. Her eyes flicked between us, sensing something unspoken. "Well, I think it's wonderful. You've clearly got talent." The rest of the night blurred into conversations, compliments, and clinking glasses. Strangers, some of Nathan's friends, approached me just to ask who had made my dress. When I told them it was mine, their expressions changed. Respect, curiosity, even admiration. And Nathan watched it all, the same way I used to watch him from the sidelines. Only now, the roles had shifted. I left the party early. Not dramatically, not with a statement or a slammed door. I slipped out while no one was looking, the way smoke drifts from a candle after the flame dies down. Outside, the air was cool. I pulled my shawl tighter and smiled to myself. He had mocked me for years, dismissed me, made jokes about my little sewing machine. But tonight, in a room full of people who mattered to him, I had become someone. Not because I raised my voice or sought revenge with bitterness, but because I had something real, something that no mockery could undo. But I'd be lying if I said it ended there, because that moment lit a fire. And what came next would be the start of something far bigger than a dress, a party, or a petty sibling rivalry. It was just the beginning. 3 days after the engagement party, I received a message on Instagram that made me sit down and reread it 3 times. It was from a woman named Amina Westbrook, a fashion consultant based in Dallas who had attended the showcase weeks before. She had stumbled across my profile through someone reposting my dress from the party, someone I hadn't even spoken to that night. Amina's message was direct, professional, and full of quiet excitement. She was curating a series for regional designers called Roots and Reinvention, and she wanted to feature me. Not just my work, but my story. For a moment, I hesitated. Sharing my story meant opening doors I had spent years trying to keep shut. About my family, about being overlooked, about how many times I almost quit. But then I thought about Nathan's face at the party, that second of hesitation, that flicker of realization that I wasn't who he thought I was anymore. I said yes. The next few weeks unfolded like a dream I was afraid to wake up from. I met with Amina in a small studio downtown. She was elegant, sharp, the kind of woman who spoke as if everything she said would one day be quoted. She asked thoughtful questions, not just about technique or fabric, but about what fashion meant to me, what I hoped people felt when they wore my designs. I told her the truth, that my clothes were stitched from silence, that every seam was something I had wanted to say but hadn't known how to. She nodded. That's exactly the story we want to tell. The interview went live 2 weeks later. I didn't tell anyone in my family. I didn't need to. By the end of the first day, the article had been shared over 6,000 times, my Etsy sales tripled, and I had 5 interview requests from local blogs and 1 from a national podcast. And then came the invitation. A regional buyer from a department store chain in Houston had read the article. They wanted to schedule a meeting, not just to purchase a few items. No, they wanted to talk about a capsule collection, my collection. I sat in my apartment, phone in hand, heart racing. I was alone, but not lonely. Not anymore. Everything I had built had started here, in this room, with no one clapping, no one watching, just the hum of the sewing machine and the sound of my own breath when I dared to dream too big. I thought about Nathan, my parents. All the years they smiled politely when I brought up a new design, then immediately changed the subject. I thought about the dinner, the mockery, the look of disbelief. And for the first time, I didn't feel angry. I felt powerful. Still, something lingered. A part of me wanted them to know, not because I needed their approval, but because they needed to understand what I had become without it. I decided to invite them, not to dinner, not to a party, but to my first trunk show, a small event Amina helped organize, showcasing my newest designs. I didn't expect them to come. In fact, I was almost certain they wouldn't, but I sent the invitation anyway. The event was held in an industrial loft in deep Elam, with tall windows, exposed brick, and an open runway flanked by folding chairs covered in linen. I arrived early, helped the models dress, did last-minute stitching, adjusted hemlines, and tried not to shake. People started arriving 30 minutes before the show. Bloggers, boutique owners, fashion students, people I didn't know and people I'd only known by username. The place filled quickly. Then I saw them. My parents walked in first. My mother looked nervous, her lips pressed tightly together like she was holding something in. My father scanned the room as if unsure whether he belonged. And behind them, Nathan, wearing a suit too expensive for the occasion, and a look that hovered somewhere between discomfort and confusion. I didn't go to them. I didn't need to. The lights dimmed. The music started. And one by one, my models began to walk. The collection was called Unspoken. Each piece represented a moment I had lived in silence. One dress was made of layered translucent fabrics, shadows over truth. Another had a structured spine sewn visibly onto the back, symbolizing the strength it takes to stand tall when no one sees you. The final look was a reinvention of the red dress I had worn to that infamous family dinner, but elevated, refined, with bold shoulders and a whispering train that followed like a secret finally let go. The room applauded. Some people stood. I didn't cry. I didn't need to. After the show, people approached me to congratulate, to ask questions, to take photos. I saw Nathan watching from a distance, arms crossed. Eventually, he approached. His voice was quieter than I remembered. "That last dress," he said. It looked familiar. I met his eyes. "It should." He nodded slowly. "You really made all of this?" "Yes." Silence stretched between us, but not uncomfortably. For once, he seemed like he was choosing his words carefully. "I didn't know," he said. I guess I just thought—" He stopped himself. "You're good, Maddie. Really good." It wasn't an apology. Not exactly, but it was something. And maybe that was enough. My mother hugged me before they left. A soft, lingering hug that felt more real than most we'd shared. She whispered, "We're proud of you." And for the first time in years, I believed she meant it. But just as I was beginning to settle into this strange new version of life, one where I was seen, respected, even celebrated, something unexpected happened. A week later, I got a call from Juliana. She sounded frantic. She asked if we could meet for coffee. I almost said no, but something in her voice caught me off guard. So we met at a small cafe near downtown, where the espresso was too strong and the seats too close together. She sat down across from me, eyes red, fingers trembling. "It's Nathan," she said. I need to tell you something. My stomach tightened. I leaned in. I think he's been lying to me. About more than one thing. She paused, looking at me like she was deciding how much to say. Then she added, and I think you're the only person who might believe me. I wasn't sure what to think. Nathan? Lying? Of course he was capable. But to her? To someone he claimed to love? I nodded slowly. Tell me everything. What she revealed over the next hour would change everything I thought I knew. Not just about Nathan, but about the life he'd carefully constructed. The image. The success. The way he had always managed to keep himself shining while casting shadows on the rest of us. And suddenly, I realized my story wasn't finished, because the truth she shared would drag old wounds back into the light. And this time, I wouldn't stay silent. Juliana's words echoed in my ears long after we left the cafe. I walked back to my apartment in a daze, not even noticing the honking cars or the laughter coming from the nearby taco stand. Her confession unraveled the image I had carefully rebuilt of Nathan as simply a narcissistic older brother with a superiority complex. No, it was worse than that. He hadn't just mocked me out of ignorance or casual cruelty. He had deliberately manipulated people, his colleagues, his fiancé, and even our parents, to keep the spotlight firmly on himself. Juliana had found messages, dozens of them. Not just inappropriate texts to other women, but carefully calculated lies about his finances, secret meetings with potential investors behind her back, and even manipulations about the family. He told her I was emotionally unstable, that I had dropped out of college because I couldn't handle the pressure, that I resented him and had a tendency to exaggerate everything for attention. That's why, she admitted with tears in her eyes, she had kept her distance from me, not because of anything I had done, but because she had been taught to mistrust me. I feel so stupid, she whispered, her voice cracking. I thought I was marrying a man who protected his family, but he's been tearing everyone apart just to make himself look better. I listened, my fists clenched under the table, my breath shallow. Every memory I had of being dismissed, mocked, or ignored now carried a new weight. It wasn't just that Nathan had a golden boy aura. He had worked for years to ensure that I never shone, and he did it with such charm, such convincing half-truths, that no one questioned him. Until now, I didn't know what to tell Juliana. She was engaged to him. She had built a future around him. I could see in her eyes the weight of every lie crashing down all at once. But she didn't want pity. She wanted clarity. She wanted to understand who he really was, and who I really was too. That night, I couldn't sleep. I paced my apartment, staring at the stacks of fabric that had once brought me comfort. Now they just looked like remnants of a world I'd been trying to escape. I opened my laptop and started typing. Not patterns, not designs, but memories. The cruel comments. The moments at school functions when my parents left early to catch Nathan's game. The way he used to steal my sketches and laugh when I cried. The email he sent to a college professor of mine claiming I had plagiarized a project. Something I never proved but always suspected. It was all there, hiding under layers of silence. I didn't know what to do with it. Not yet, but I knew I had to do something. The next day, I visited Amina. I didn't plan to tell her everything, but she saw it in my face the moment I walked in. What happened? She asked, closing her laptop and giving me her full attention. I told her. Not every detail, but enough for her to understand that this wasn't just about family drama. It was about control, image, and the slow erosion of identity at the hands of someone who had always needed to be the center of every room. When I finished, she sat in silence for a long moment. You know, she finally said, you've just described the perfect concept for your next show. I blinked. What? Reclamation, she said. You don't need to tell the world everything, but you can reclaim your story. Tell it through your work. People are already listening, Madison. Let them see what strength looks like when it's born from betrayal. It was the spark I didn't know I needed. Over the next month, I poured myself into the project. I called the collection Threadbare. Each piece was designed to represent something that had been stripped away: dignity, trust, voice, and then reassembled into something powerful. One look featured visible seams and raw edges. as if the garment had been torn apart and hastily stitched back together. Another was made entirely of reclaimed fabric scraps, sewn into an asymmetrical silhouette that danced between elegance and chaos. The centerpiece was a gown that looked delicate from the front, soft tulle, muted colors, but the back was armored with overlapping panels of leather and silk, forming a spine that reached from the neck to the floor. I invited Juliana to every fitting. She became my muse in a way I hadn't expected. Watching her reclaim her power, piece by piece, was like watching my own healing in real time. She ended things with Nathan quietly, without fanfare. She returned the ring, canceled the wedding, and moved into a friend's spare room while she figured out her next steps. Through it all, she stayed gracious. She never asked for revenge, but I could see the fire in her eyes grow a little brighter each day. As the show approached, local press started buzzing. Word had spread after my last showcase, and this time, there were rumors of talent scouts attending. I tried not to think about it. I told myself it didn't matter if they came or not. This show wasn't about exposure. It was about freedom. My parents hadn't spoken to me since the last event. I knew Nathan had told them something to explain Juliana's sudden departure, probably something flattering to himself and damaging to me. But I didn't care. I wasn't designing for their approval anymore. The night of the show arrived like thunder. The venue was darker this time, more industrial, with steel beams and a concrete runway. It was perfect. Guests arrived wearing muted tones, and the models stood in the shadows, waiting for the music to cue. As I stood backstage, I felt an odd calm settle over me. This wasn't about proving anything anymore. It was about release. The lights went down. The first beat hit, and one by one my pieces walked into the world. You could feel the tension in the room. People leaned forward. Phones went up. Every step down the runway told a different story, of silence, of betrayal, of breaking, of rebuilding. The crowd didn't applaud until the very end, as if they were holding their breath with me. And when they did, it wasn't polite or mild. It was roaring, standing ovation, whistles, cheers, tears. I stepped onto the runway only because I had to. My heart was in my throat. As I turned to walk back, I saw something I hadn't expected. Nathan. He stood at the back of the room, near the exit, alone, not clapping, just watching. His face was unreadable. Not pride, not anger, just silence. The same kind he had imposed on me for years now returned to him like a mirror. I didn't break eye contact. I didn't smile. I didn't nod. I simply turned and walked away. Backstage, Juliana hugged me so tightly I almost couldn't breathe. "You did it," she whispered. "You told the truth, and you made it beautiful." For the first time in my life, I felt whole. Not because they saw me, but because I saw myself, and I liked what I saw. A week after the show, I was back in my studio, stitching the final hem of a custom gown for a new client, when I received an unexpected email. The subject line was simple: opportunity to collaborate. Urban Vogue. At first, I thought it was spam. A scam, maybe. But when I opened the message and saw the signature of Leanne Prescott, creative director for the Urban Vogue Collective, one of the most talked about underground fashion circles in the country, I froze. She had seen photos of my latest collection. She was impressed. She wanted to meet. I reread the email 5 times, letting each word settle into my mind like drops of water on dry soil. This wasn't just another feature or boutique offer. This was a possible entrance into the kind of world I had only watched from afar. A place where designers weren't just acknowledged, they were remembered. I closed my laptop and just sat there for a moment, trying to process how far I had come from that silent girl in the corner of family dinners, trying not to draw attention to the thread clippings on her jeans. The meeting with Leanne was set for the following Thursday at a gallery downtown. When I arrived, I felt the weight of every expectation in the room. Leanne was tall, elegant, dressed in a crisp all-black suit that looked sculpted onto her frame. Her eyes, though soft, missed nothing. She greeted me with a firm handshake and motioned for me to sit beside her at a small circular table away from the noise. "I've followed your last 2 shows," she said, skipping any small talk. Threadbare in particular was a gut punch. Visceral, beautiful, honest. I thanked her, still half convinced I was dreaming. We're curating a showcase for new voices in design, she continued. A blend of visual art and fashion, rooted in personal narratives. Your work fits that perfectly. But more than that, I think your voice is important right now. My voice. Not my technique, not my metrics. My voice. That was what she saw. She explained the showcase would open in 4 months, in Los Angeles, with media coverage and buyers from both coasts. Each designer would present a mini collection of 6 pieces, all new, all unreleased, and each would be given a chance to speak about the emotional architecture behind their work. I didn't hesitate. I said yes. But deep down, I knew this meant going deeper than I ever had before. If unspoken was me standing up and threadbare was me fighting back, this new collection had to be something more. Something that wasn't just reaction, it had to be declaration. I started designing that night. I called the collection Inheritance. It wasn't about money or legacy in the traditional sense. It was about what we carry, grief, silence, anger, fear, and how we transform it into something worthy of keeping. The pieces came to me like fragments of a confession. One was built from deconstructed business suits, sliced and reformed into a silhouette of rebellion. Another was made with sheer panels that revealed hand-stitched words beneath, phrases people had said to me that once made me shrink. Now they were part of the art. But as I worked, something unexpected began to gnaw at me. I couldn't focus. My thoughts were fractured, interrupted by flashes of memories I hadn't thought about in years. Not just about Nathan, but about childhood moments. Of my mother brushing my hair and saying, "Maybe one day you'll make clothes for real people." Of my father's silence when I won a high school art award. I realized I had carried so many ghosts, layered them into everything I wore and made. And somewhere beneath all of it, I still wanted them to see me. Not just see my success, but see the child they once overlooked. That desire, unspoken but present, scared me. Then, 3 weeks before the trip to LA, my mother called. "We heard about the next show," she said cautiously. "Nathan told us." My hand tensed around the phone. "Did he?" "He's been different lately." I didn't answer. "He came by last weekend. Brought some of your magazine features. He showed us your work. He said he was proud." The silence on the line was thick. "And you?" I finally asked. She took a breath. "We didn't know how to support you. That's the truth. We saw Nathan rising and we thought that was the path to be proud of. But watching you, seeing what you've made, the way people respond to it, we were wrong. It didn't feel like closure, but it felt like movement." I left for Los Angeles a few days later, carrying with me 6 pieces of myself, packed tightly into garment bags and guarded like heirlooms. The venue was a renovated museum near the Arts District, with high ceilings, natural light, and the unmistakable electricity of creative risk. The day of the event, I barely slept. I walked the hall 4 times. I triple-checked every hem, every label, every model's fitting. Then the doors opened. The crowd was different here. Sharper, cooler. People wore fashion like armor and art like perfume. I stood by my collection as people filtered through. Some took photos. Others whispered to each other, nodding. Then, just before my turn to speak, I saw him. Nathan. He was standing by the far wall, alone again, hands in his pockets, watching me with a look I couldn't place. It wasn't mockery. It wasn't shame. It was something more complicated, like recognition. When I stepped onto the small platform to address the crowd, my palms were damp. My voice shook for the first 2 sentences. Then I remembered why I was there. "My name is Madison Clark," I began, "and for most of my life, I believed I had to stay small to keep the peace." I told them about Plano, about growing up in a house where success looked like suits and speeches and scholarships, about learning to sew in silence, about designing dresses when no one was watching, about finding power not in being seen, but in surviving being invisible. "My collection," I said, "is not just clothing. It's a map of everything I've had to carry, and everything I've chosen to leave behind." When I stepped down, the applause felt like sunlight after years underground. Nathan approached me later, when the room had thinned. "I deserved everything you said," he admitted. and probably more. I didn't offer forgiveness. I didn't owe him that, but I listened. I always needed to be the star, he said, looking at the floor. And I couldn't handle it when you started shining. I watched him struggle for words. For once, he didn't find any. I'm not here for you, I said quietly, but I'm glad you're here. He nodded, understanding. And just like that, the power shifted again. This time, I didn't need revenge. I had already won. The weeks after the Los Angeles showcase moved like warm wind, fast but gentle, carrying me forward into a life I had only dared to imagine. My collection, Inheritance, was featured in 2 digital fashion magazines within the first week. Leanne called to tell me I had been one of the top 3 designers most requested for follow-ups by buyers and stylists in attendance. Suddenly, I was no longer someone local, no longer a girl from Plano sewing in secret. I was Madison Clark, a name people in the industry started to say out loud in rooms I hadn't yet entered. But the success, while exhilarating, came with something else too. A new kind of quiet. Not the kind that bruised like the one I lived in before. This was a silence filled with reflection. I had gotten what I thought I wanted. Recognition, respect, the validation of my voice. And yet I found myself waking up at night, restless, remembering things I hadn't thought of in years. The way I used to hide my sketches under my mattress. The time in high school when I was chosen to design the spring play costumes and Nathan joked, "Oh, you're the wardrobe girl now?" And the auditorium laughed with him. Or how, when I once cried to my mother that he had ruined my fabric with scissors out of spite, she said, "He's just teasing. Don't be dramatic." I started wondering what forgiveness meant. Not the kind you give to someone else, but the kind you give to yourself. For staying quiet too long, for letting other people narrate your story before you had a chance to write it. One morning, while drinking coffee by the window of my apartment, I picked up my phone and called Juliana. We hadn't talked much since Los Angeles, not because of any falling out, but because she'd been traveling, rediscovering herself. She answered almost immediately. "I was thinking about you," she said. I smiled. "I wanted to ask you something." "Shoot. Do you remember when you told me you thought you were marrying a man who protected his family?" She was silent for a beat. "I remember. Did it hurt more because of the lie, or because you believed it?" She took a breath. "Both. But mostly because I knew deep down it wasn't true. I just didn't want to admit it." I let that sink in. "Why do you ask?" she added gently. "Because I think I'm ready to stop trying to get apologies from people who never learned how to give them." She didn't say anything at first. Then, with a soft laugh, "Sounds like you're free." That word stuck with me. Free. For so long, I thought freedom would look like success. Runways, interviews, praise. But now I was beginning to realize it wasn't about any of that. Freedom was being able to stand in a room with your past and not feel the need to flinch. It was being able to sit across from someone who once made you feel small and not need to prove a single thing. Later that week, I was invited to return to the Fashion Collective in Dallas. Not just as a featured designer this time, but as a mentor for new talent. I walked into the space where it all began, the industrial loft where I'd once stood trembling behind racks of my own work, and now I stood tall, confident, greeting young designers who looked at me the way I used to look at anyone with a platform and a voice. There was one girl, maybe 19, quiet, her arms crossed protectively over her chest as others discussed their collections with ease. I recognized her instantly. Not literally, but emotionally. That posture, that hesitation. I approached her gently. "Tell me about your work," I said. She looked down. "It's not really ready." I nodded. "Show me anyway." She hesitated, then handed me her sketchbook. The designs were raw, a little uneven, but they were bold, brave, full of defiance and yearning. "What do you want your pieces to say?" I asked. She looked surprised by the question. "I guess I want people to know what it feels like to not be picked." That nearly took the air out of me. I smiled. "Then they're perfect. You're on the right path." She beamed, just barely, but it was enough. On my way home that night, I thought about how many girls were out there right now, sitting in their bedrooms, stitching quietly, afraid to share, waiting for someone to tell them their voice mattered. I knew I couldn't reach them all, but maybe I didn't have to. Maybe if I just kept showing up as myself, they'd see it was possible. When I got back to Plano for a weekend visit, my first in almost a year, I found myself driving by my childhood home. The porch was the same. The oak tree still leaned toward the street like it was listening in. I almost kept going, but then I stopped. I rang the bell and my mother opened the door. Her eyes softened instantly. "Madison," she said. "We weren't expecting—" "I know," I replied. "I just wanted to stop by." She stepped aside, and I entered the house that once felt like the whole world, and now felt like a page I had turned but never finished reading. My father was in the living room, reading the newspaper, as always. He looked up and gave a small nod. I returned it. Nathan wasn't there. I didn't ask where he was. I didn't need to know. We talked. Not about fashion or success or anything particularly deep. Just surface things. How the neighborhood had changed. How the dog 2 houses down still barked at everything. But even in that, something had shifted. They asked how I was doing, and actually listened. My mother said she saw one of my designs in a boutique window in Dallas and told the clerk, "That's my daughter's work." She looked proud when she said it, but more importantly, she looked like she meant it. Before I left, I walked past my old room. The door was cracked open. Inside, it had been turned into a guest room now. The bed was made, a neutral comforter, generic wall art. But tucked in the corner, near the closet, was my old dress form. Still standing, still waiting. I placed my hand on it and closed my eyes. I didn't need to reclaim this space. I had already built my own. As I drove away from the house, I didn't feel the usual weight in my chest. There was no more ache, no more craving for something they never quite gave me. I had learned how to give it to myself. My phone buzzed with a message from Amina. "New York is next. Get ready." I laughed, out loud, alone in the car. The sound surprised me, honest and free, because this was my life now, and I was finally living it on my own terms. New York was louder than I remembered. The streets pulsed with energy that seemed to hum beneath the pavement. I had visited once, years ago, as a student with a dream and no business card. I'd stood outside fashion houses then, staring at the windows and wondering how people got through those doors. Now, I wasn't just walking through them, I was being invited in. The Urban Vogue Collective had partnered with an international design house to showcase Voices of Tomorrow, an exhibit that would blend multimedia storytelling with avant-garde fashion. They selected 8 designers from around the world, and I was one of them. I flew in with my garments in garment bags and my heart beating out of rhythm. The exhibit would take place in a converted warehouse in Brooklyn, the kind of space with exposed beams, painted brick, and windows so large you could see the city reflected in every pane. My corner was reserved for 6 new pieces, my final installment in the trilogy I'd unknowingly begun with Unspoken. This collection was called Echo. It was my way of exploring what stayed with us after we thought we had let go. Each piece used sound elements, tiny speakers sewn into the garments, whispered audio played softly through hidden seams. They didn't speak loudly, they whispered. Words like, "I see you, you're allowed to be here, you were always enough." During setup, I worked with a sound designer who helped embed recordings of spoken word into the garments. One of the voices was mine, another was Juliana's, and one belonged to the 19-year-old girl from the Dallas mentoring program. It felt poetic, our voices woven into fashion, carried on the shoulders of people brave enough to wear truth out loud. The night of the opening, people gathered in clusters, murmuring admiration. This time, I didn't hide near the back. I moved through the room with quiet confidence, answering questions, watching reactions. Some people cried, not because the designs were sad, but because they felt seen. One woman told me the dress made her feel like she was walking in every version of herself at once. The broken, the healing, the whole. That was the kind of praise I never imagined I'd hear. Not about fabric, not about me. I received an offer the following morning from a European gallery wanting to feature Echo in a traveling exhibit. I accepted without hesitation, not just because it was exposure or a milestone, but because I wanted these pieces to travel farther than I ever could. I wanted them to whisper into rooms I would never enter, to speak for girls I would never meet. Later that week, I sat in Central Park on a quiet bench with coffee in hand. My phone buzzed with another message from Nathan. He had started sending them occasionally. Nothing dramatic. Simple things. Saw your interview. Powerful stuff. Or Mom said your design's in Paris now. That's huge. I never replied, but I read them all. Not out of spite. I just didn't have much to say to the version of him who was still catching up to the version of me that no longer needed approval. Juliana came to New York for a few days, and we met at a rooftop bar overlooking the skyline. She had cut her hair short and looked radiant, lighter. She was taking a gap year before applying to grad school in psychology. She said helping people out of their own emotional cages felt like the only thing that made sense anymore. You've changed so much, I told her. I think I just stopped pretending, she said. You gave me permission, Madison. You were the first person who didn't ask me to make myself smaller. We clinked glasses. There was no need to say more. We knew. In the months that followed, I started writing. Not articles or interviews, but a book. A memoir in threads. Each chapter was a story about a garment I had created and the memory stitched inside it. The publisher loved the concept. Said it blurred the line between autobiography and art. That was exactly the point. My life had always been somewhere in between invisibility and spotlight, between silence and voice. The book came out 6 months later. It was called Patterned Silence. It landed softly but deeply, finding its way onto nightstands, into design schools, onto gift lists for young women who needed to remember they were more than who they were told to be. I received letters, some handwritten, others typed, telling me that my story felt like their story, that someone finally said it out loud, that they were starting to believe they mattered too. And then, on an ordinary Tuesday afternoon, I received an invitation I hadn't expected. The University of Texas at Austin was offering me an honorary award for artistic contribution to social narrative through fashion, the same university where Nathan had once shined, where I had been a shadow. I was being called back not as a sister, but as a story worth honoring. I wore a gown of my own design, charcoal black with gold thread tracing invisible lines of strength across the bodice. When I took the stage, the lights didn't scare me anymore. They felt warm, welcoming. I used to believe, I said during my speech, that silence was safer, that if you stayed small, you wouldn't be targeted. But I learned that silence isn't safety. It's just a cage without walls. And breaking free means risking everything, but gaining yourself. The applause was quiet at first. Then it grew. I spotted my parents in the audience. They were standing, clapping, tears in their eyes. I never needed that, but it felt good to have it now. Back in Plano, a year later, I walked into the small high school auditorium where it all began. I had been invited to speak at a career day. I wore jeans and flats. Nothing dramatic. Just me. The auditorium smelled the same. Old curtains, floor polish, fluorescent lights. I stood on the same stage where Nathan once gave his homecoming speech, and I told a room of teenagers that there is no right way to be worthy, that your voice matters even if no one hears it at first, that sometimes the world is loud because it's trying to drown you out, but the quiet you build inside yourself is the loudest thing you'll ever need. As I stepped down from the stage, a girl with a shy smile handed me a folded paper. I opened it in the parking lot. It read, "Thank you for making me feel like I could take up space." I folded the note and tucked it in my purse. That night, I stood in front of my full-length mirror, wearing nothing fancy, just an old, faded t-shirt and leggings. My hair was up. My feet were bare. I looked at myself, not for flaws or fit, but for presence. I was still here, still whole, and finally, more than anything else, at peace. The echo had become my own, not a haunting, but a harmony. I had turned every mockery into a stitch, every silence into a design, every dismissal into a legacy. And in the end, my voice was the loudest thing in the room. Have you ever had someone close to you try to dim your light just because they couldn't handle your shine? Share your story in the comments. I want to hear from those who've had to fight for their voice in the shadows of those meant to love them. If this story touched something deep inside you, please like and subscribe. There are more stories coming. Stories of strength, survival, and rising above. Send this video to someone who needs to be reminded that their pain doesn't define them. Their courage does. And remember, you are not too much. You were just never in the right room before. Thank you for listening to my story.